Well, I've said it before, but I'll say it again. The Bible is not a boring book. Today's story takes place in the book of Genesis, and I believe we're in chapter 38. The timeline of our story is Joseph has just been sold into slavery in Egypt. Joseph is currently working for the Egyptian captain of the guard, Potiphar. So what we're going to be talking about today is what was going on back home with Joseph's brothers and his family while he was in prison and in slavery in Egypt. So today, our story takes place back in Canaan. The Canaanites and Joseph's family were living in the same area at this time. And one of Joseph's oldest brothers' names is Judah. Judah had 3 sons by his wife, and when his first son was grown, he found a wife for his first son, and her name was Tamar. God tells us in verse 7 that this firstborn son, whose name was Er, E-R is how you spell it, was a wicked man, and he died. So his wife Tamar is a young widow who is childless. She didn't have any children by Er, Judah's firstborn. So, children. Now, I've touched on this before. Children were everything to a woman during this time period. They were a mark of physical and spiritual health, and it also had a way of raising a woman's social status in the neighborhood and in the community. So if a woman didn't have children, other women had a tendency to look down on her and think things like maybe she was living in sin or something. So having a child was important. Understand, it wasn't God who looked down on these women for not being able to have children. It was other people. Always remember that. God wasn't being judgmental. People are. So son number 1 dies. Now, Jewish culture looked to the next oldest son to marry the brother's widow and raise a family with her. Remember the story of Ruth and Boaz? How Boaz was a close relative of Ruth's family, and since Ruth was a widow, Boaz agreed to marry her and take care of her. And so that's kind of the same situation here. So Judah has a second son. Judah has 3 sons. Judah's second son marries Tamar, so she could have a baby to carry on her first husband's name. That was the culture. Well, this second son was a greedy and selfish man, and he did not want to do right by his brother or his brother's widow, and so he didn't want to make a baby with Tamar. So he refused to have a baby with her, and God was, the Bible says, very displeased, and God took this second son's life. He died. So Judah now has 2 sons that have married Tamar, and they have both died young. But remember, he has a third son who was a little bit younger than his 2 brothers. Judah tells Tamar, his daughter-in-law, that he wants her to go back to her father's house and wait until the third son is old enough to marry her. So she obeys. She goes back to her father's house and waits for the third son to grow up so that he can marry her and they can have a family. But here's the problem. Judah, her father-in-law, doesn't really want to give his third son to Tamar to marry and to have children because he thinks she's cursed or something. I mean, he's already lost 2 sons by being married to this woman and no children. So Judah's third son grows up, and Tamar is left at her father's house waiting for Judah to give his third son to marry her. So let's stop here and recap real quick. Judah has 3 sons. Son number 1 marries Tamar and dies. They have no children. Son number 2 marries Tamar and dies, and they have no children. Son number 3 is supposed to marry Tamar and have children, but Judah is procrastinating on this, and he's not having a wedding. The wedding is not happening, and Tamar is starting to figure it out. Poor Tamar, okay? Loving 2 husbands, young, and not having children. Remember how people viewed women who couldn't get pregnant, we talked about. It was like they were a marked woman, okay? They were bad luck, or they had sin in their life. Silly, okay? But that's the truth. That's how they thought about that. So time goes on. And Judah's wife dies. Judah, the father-in-law, his own wife dies. And he's got this son who's unmarried, and his wife dies. And he's lonely. Judah's wife passes away, and he's a lonely guy. So he takes a business trip. Thinking, well, where is this story going? Lots of different things are happening. This is the timeline of the story. Tamar's waiting around for this third son to get married to her, and Judah puts it off, and instead he takes a business trip after his wife passes away. Tamar finds out that her father-in-law is taking a trip a little ways away. So this probably tells her that he's not really making plans on the wedding, right? So he is going to travel to a certain area for his business, and it's sheep shearing time. He has a lot of sheep, and so he's going to take his sheep in to have them sheared. It's a business trip. She realizes that she's being strung along, and her father-in-law has no intention of giving his third son to her to be her husband so that she can have kids. She catches on, and it's at this time where Tamar decides, she's going to have to be in charge of her own future and her own destiny. So she makes a plan. This is what she does. She changes out of her widow's clothes. Back then, when you were a widow, you had certain things that you wore so that everybody knew you were a widow. So she changes out of her widow's clothing and puts on different clothes, and she puts on a veil to hide her face so she's not recognized. She goes to this area where Judah has gone to do his business and waits there in the open area where people are traveling through. And she waits for Judah, her father-in-law, to come by. Sure enough, Judah, her father-in-law, comes by, and he sees her. And he sees her wearing these clothes and a veil. And Judah thinks that this woman that he sees is a prostitute. By the way, prostitutes cover their faces at this time in history. That's how people could tell that they were prostitutes. They covered their face with a veil. So Judah goes to her, and he asks her to give him of her services. We'll say it that way. He doesn't have any clue that it's his daughter-in-law. No idea. She asks him, okay, well, what will you give me if I do this? And he offers her a sheep from his flock, but he didn't have it with him at the time. Remember, it was sheep shearing time. All of his sheep are at the sheep shearers with their wool being removed, cut off from them so they can sell it. So he doesn't have a sheep with him right then, but he says, I'll give you a sheep, but I don't have it with me right now. So she tells him that he can pay her with the sheep later, but that she would need something from him in the meantime, like earnest money, okay, like a deposit, I guess. I don't know. Something that he would get back from her once he came back with the sheep that he promised her. So he's like, okay. And so she tells Judah to leave his staff and his bracelets and his signet. Now, a signet was like, it was really important for people to do business with. It was like their identification, their ID. They would seal packages and seal, letters, and it was like someone's driver's license. Things like that. It was important. He really couldn't do any business, legal, normal business without the signet. So he agrees to leave it with her until he can come back with the sheep. So he agrees. He gives her his ID basically, and they spend the night together, and he leaves. She waits till he leaves. She changes out of these new clothes that she had put on and puts her widow's clothes back on and takes the veil off of her face. And she goes home. She goes home. Judah later tries to find her by having a sheep brought to her, but she's gone. Okay, she's gone out of there back home. He can't find her. And she's got his important identification. So he figures he's not going to go try looking for her because it's going to be embarrassing. And so he's just like, oh, well, I'll have to come up with, something else to do business with. I don't know what he used. But anyway, she's gone and he doesn't know where she went. Fast forward 3 months. 3 months go by. And it is found out that Tamar is pregnant. Judah's daughter-in-law, the one who tricked him into spending the night with her, is pregnant. Well, the Canaanite law for this kind of situation is for the woman to be put to death. Now, I know that seems very, very harsh, and it is. They bring Tamar out and tell her that she's going to be executed for getting pregnant and not being married, for being a harlot, for acting like a harlot, they said. So let's stop and consider something. Let's stop and consider the utter hypocrisy in this. She's going to die, but, she's going to die for being with a man that she was not married to. But Judah gets no punishment at all for cavorting with what he thought was a prostitute, right? Now, granted, he wasn't married, but God looks at sexual sin as sexual sin, okay? Just because he wasn't married doesn't mean that he needs to be doing that. If you have those desires, the Bible tells us to get married. So Judah was not in the right or in the wrong any more than she was in the right or in the wrong, okay? Remember that. Yes, it's a double standard completely. It's not fair, and no, God was not okay with it either. Okay, so these people who think that God was okay with women being enslaved and being, put down, and it's just, God wasn't okay with it. That was man's doing. Man's doing. Now, God did put Adam in charge of his household, and Eve was told that she would be subservient or submissive to her husband. But God was not okay with this, okay, with what Judah had done. God's plan was for Judah's number 2 son to marry this woman and have children with her. And when he died, it was God's plan for the 3rd son to marry this woman and have a family with her. And because of Judah's intervention and Judah's disobedience, that didn't happen, okay? Now, I'm not telling you to go out and trick someone into having a baby, okay? That is not what I mean at all, okay? I will get to what I am intending to teach you here in just a second. But anyway, so Tamar is in trouble, okay? She is pregnant. She's about to be put to death, and suddenly she pulls out Judah's staff and his signet and the bracelets that he left her. And she says, "Whosever these are is the father of my child." Do you know whose these are? Do you recognize these? And Judah, of course, does, and is so ashamed and convicted for what he did. He says that she can live, and that he admits his sin, admits that he was in the wrong for not giving his third son to Tamar to marry and have a family with. So he puts her away and allows her to raise her children. And he doesn't marry her. He doesn't go in unto her anymore, the Bible says. And she has twins. Okay, she has 2 boys. So the takeaway for the lesson today: God's plan and his timeline are the best, okay? Quit trying to manipulate events and circumstances to fit your wants and your needs. God has a perfect plan for all of our lives. All he asks is us to trust him, wait on him, and be obedient to that, and have patience. Allow God to be glorified in your life and work in your life. It's how your faith grows stronger, by the way, okay? Number 2, keep your word. Judah was a really good example in this story of someone who did not keep his word. He lied to his daughter-in-law. He promised her a husband and just didn't follow through and ignored it and just put it off. And guys, Tamar was completely dependent upon her father-in-law to help her create a life. She couldn't just go off and get married to anybody else she wanted. There was a system put in place. She was promised to the third son. She couldn't do anything until Judah made a move with this third son. She was completely dependent upon him for her future, and he just disregarded it. So keep your word. Are you a trustworthy person? Are you trustworthy? Do you keep your word? Can people trust that what you say is true? Can people trust that what you say you will complete, things that you promise? Or do you just make promises that you have no intention of fulfilling, like Judah in this story? He knew full well what he was doing. I don't know if he felt like it would just go away if he ignored it, but that's not right, okay? Don't be like that. Don't be that person. Your word and reputation are important, especially if you claim to be a Christian. If you claim to be a Christian and you're known as like the biggest liar out there, that's a terrible testimony for Christ, okay? Please don't do that. Trust God and deal honestly with your fellow man. And that is the takeaways for today's lesson. Tomorrow I'll have something new for you. This kind of situation here at the way I'm recording this is kind of new to me, so I'm hoping to figure some things out and make it a little bit better, but the content's what's important. So anyway, subscribe to this channel if you want to get notifications. Hit the notification bell so that you won't have to be reminded through Instagram. Okay, I'll see you all tomorrow. I love you and miss you all. FB teens, I miss you so much. We'll see you later. Bye.